Welcome back, fellow football fanatics, to Wednesday's episode of College Football with Sam. It's been a great day. There's been a lot of topics that I've been mulling through, and I have 12 that I want to discuss today. The most impactful players in the college football playoff, a separate segment about the best quarterbacks in the college football playoff, why Blue Bloods, no matter where their status is at right now, should expect to be in the college football playoff, talking about some expectations in regards to Michigan State and Nebraska, discussing Oklahoma and Miami and why I think they will win their respective games, and a few other topics that we will get to throughout this stream. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Do all of those things. That would be phenomenal. And let's just have a good stream. Let me know down below who you think is going to win these games on Friday and on Saturday. I personally think, as we've already discussed in Monday's episode, that Miami, Oklahoma, Oregon, and Ole Miss will win their respective games and advance to the quarterfinals, where Oregon will play Texas Tech, Oklahoma will play Indiana, Ole Miss will play Georgia, and Miami will have what would be a historic matchup against Ohio State, as the last time these two teams faced in the postseason was that memorable 2002. Now, wait. Okay, good. I'm not muted. For whatever reason, I thought I was muted there very briefly, but doesn't look like I am. So, yeah, we're going to get started. What's happening here? Seems like there's something weird. I don't. People can't hear me. Hold on. I don't think that people can hear me. Trying to figure out what's going on. Yeah, there's something that's not. There's something that's not quite right. I don't exactly get what it is, but yeah. Now there's a difference. Now there's a difference. I'm gonna check my audio real quickly. So just hold on, guys. Yeah, I don't know what's going on, but there's something weird going on with the audio, but we'll try to get through it. So, yeah. Anyway, just ignore that. We have a lot to talk about today. Don't want to get down on that too much with the audio issues. If there are any audio issues, just let me know. I'll try to find a way to fix it if it persists, but I think we figured it out. I want to first and foremost discuss the most impactful players in the playoffs, players that will be difference makers in playoff games, especially if they are teams that are on the top. So, for example, and a lot of these first round teams where I don't think they have much of a chance to escape the quarterfinals, their players really aren't listed. So for Texas A&M and Miami, for example, I'm going to need to see them get through Ohio State before I list their players as the most impactful in the playoffs, because I have a very hard time seeing them beat Ohio State. For Ole Miss's Trinidad Chambliss, for example, it's pretty similar. Like I have a hard time seeing him be so impactful because I think Ole Miss is very limited. Similar with a lot of players for Alabama and Oklahoma. Now, in the semifinals, I'll probably redo a lot of these topics for the semifinals because by then we'll have the 4 best teams. We'll have a sample size of teams being able to get through 2 games or teams with a bye winning their first game, and that'll be very exciting stuff. But these players, I have 8 of them, I think are going to be the most impactful players in the college football playoff as they are on great teams, most of whom I think can win it all. They are also players that can win games for their team, that can carry their teams to victory. And I want to do a little bit of uniqueness to it as well. I didn't want to just stick to the basic, most well-known players. Of course, for some, you got to do that because it's, nature of college football. But, yeah, let's get to it. The most impactful players in college football reside amongst the best teams. And I think right now, the best teams in college football are Georgia, Oregon, Indiana, Ohio State, and Texas Tech. Let's start from the bottom on up. So starting with those 5 teams, starting at the number 5 seed, the Oregon Ducks. Brycen Moore is someone who's very impactful because his health in part determines what Oregon can and can't do. Oregon, with healthy wide receivers, can probably, with the quarterback play of Dante Moore, Will Stein calling plays, the offensive line they have, which might be the best in the college football playoff, they can attack any defense and probably match up well with just about any defensive back group in the playoffs if they have completely healthy receivers, including tight end Kenyon Sadiq, and they have the rushing attack and offensive line and quarterback play that they've showcased in the month of November and really for the entire season with some ups and downs here and there. Brycen Moore is their most freakish wide receiver, their most athletic receiver. Getting Evan Stewart back would help, yes, but they have not had him for the entire season, so I'm not entirely counting on that. But with Brycen Moore, it sounded like his injury was not season-ending. We'll see if that's the case. He has not played in the entire month of November, so I'm curious to see what happens to Oregon if they get him back. I think without him, they can still win some playoff games. I don't know if they can win it all with their receiver group being as banged up as it has been for much of November. So Brycen Moore is impactful for the reason that he gives Oregon more pathways to win and opens up their offense. Jacob Rodriguez, linebacker for Texas Tech, 117 tackles, a sack, 7 forced fumbles, just missed out on being a Heisman finalist. Rodriguez is one of the more impactful players in the sport. And in the playoffs, with his team having issues in the red zone, with them really only being able to move the ball in between the 20s, and once they get inside the 20 or the 10, they have issues. They're only successful in operating out of certain formations. Their quarterback is somewhat of a glass cannon. This team needs defense to win. That is their path here. And Jacob Rodriguez, with the amount of turnovers he's forced, with the amount of impact plays he's had, is someone who can win a game by himself. And Texas Tech is very blessed and fortunate to have him. They've done a good job of developing him, and their defense is the most explosive defense in college football. It's one of the best in college football. It's up there with Indiana and Ohio State, and them with Texas Tech, I think, make up the 3 best defenses in college football right now. Also, 4 interceptions. He's forced 11 total turnovers, which is absolutely crazy. His partner in crime on defense, David Bailey, we could have also brought up defensive end Romello Height, but David Bailey, with more than a sack per game, 3 forced fumbles, he is going to be a day 2, day 1 player. He has a limitless ceiling, and his floor is very high, and he stayed healthy to this point. Against their side of the bracket, which I think the bottom half of the bracket, the 2 and the 3 seed, is the toughest because Georgia and Ohio State are 2 of the top 3 teams. And unlike Indiana, they fulfill the blue chip ratio. So that's the most talented side of the bracket. However, the best side of the bracket, if you're solely looking at offensive line play, is the top half with what Oregon and Indiana have, especially since both of them are mostly healthy at that position, if not totally healthy. If Texas Tech wants to go on a run, they are going up against the best offensive lines outside of maybe Georgia that they will play in the playoffs. And having a player like David Bailey who can get pressure on any quarterback, who is a weapon at finishing his pressures, at disrupting the quarterback, disrupting offenses, having impact plays, making them, and who probably, if we're being honest, can make a move or beat any offensive tackle on any given play, that's going to be very helpful, especially with their situation on offense. Moving on to Georgia. So we went from the 5 seed to the 4 seed onto the 3 seed. Zachariah Branch is particularly intriguing to me, as he's Georgia's wide receiver 1. Gunnar Stockton has performed well. He's been up and down at times. But one thing he has that Carson Beck did not have last year, and one thing Georgia has this year they did not last year, is receivers. A big part of the reason why they lost to Notre Dame is they had a backup QB and no receivers, and they were banged up. Now, Georgia is a little bit healthier. They have far better receivers, both at tight end and wide receiver, and their quarterback, Gunnar Stockton, is much better this year than he was last year. Georgia's defense has been peaking at the right time. Is it one of the best defenses in the country overall? Probably not. Is it one of the best in the country right now if you're really, really turning up the dial on recency bias? Yes. What they are going to have issues with, if anything, is probably with how Gunnar Stockton's been up and down, the passing offense, and having to rely on Stockton if they need to. That could nib them in the butt. What helps with that is having an athletic wide receiver 1 in Zachariah Branch like they do. He's impactful because when they play Ohio State, and believe me, that's going to be the semifinal matchup. That's going to be the Fiesta Bowl matchup. When they play Ohio State is going to make life for Georgia's offense hard. That will be a low-scoring defensive game. Ohio State will probably be favored. One edge that Georgia will have because they got Zachariah Branch is Zachariah Branch will have an edge over their corners. And that can be the difference between Georgia winning or Ohio State having more first-round players, resulting in them pulling away. Zachariah Branch can be that much of a difference maker. Speaking of Ohio State, Sonny Styles and Jeremiah Smith, we'll get to Jeremiah Smith in a few seconds, are, I think, their most impactful players in the playoffs. There is Caleb Downs for sure. And I think Caleb Downs is a better player than Sonny Styles and still the best defensive player in college football. However, with the way Patricia runs his defense, which is more linebacker-centric, and Knowles was more safety and defensive line-centric, I think that having Styles, who has not missed a tackle and who's in the middle of the field constantly and does a very good job reading defenses, is extremely fundamentally sound. And he is the epitome of Ohio State's past 2 defenses, really past 3, where they don't give up explosive plays and they keep everything in front of them. They're not the most explosive defense because in the past 3 years, they haven't forced a ton of turnovers, but they do a spectacular job at making sure you do not get behind them. And that's what Sonny Styles does. You don't get behind him. You have to go through him, and you don't go through him either. He has not missed a single tackle this year. Out of all 81 of his total tackles, he has not missed one. And he's projected to be a first-round linebacker. At the very worst, he'll be a day 2 linebacker. He's tall, he's long, he's built, he's intelligent. He is the perfect linebacker and quite possibly the best linebacker in the college football playoff. So that's going to matter, especially when If you're playing Miami, if you're playing Georgia, most teams you play will have better rushing offenses than passing offenses, or at least more consistent and threatening rushing offenses than passing offenses. So Sonny Styles especially will be important in that regard. Jeremiah Smith, I think it's just a no-brainer as to why he's impactful, because he is one of the best, if not the best player in college football. I still think he should have won the Heisman. I know that he did not have the numbers exactly to totally justify that, but part of that is because Ohio State loves to chew the entire clock. Whether or not you agree with that, it's just a fact. That's what they like to do. And they like to run the football, actually still a little bit more than they pass the football. They like to be extremely balanced there. And they lean more on their defense than not. And they have issues in the red zone. So a lot of things went against him, and especially his production and his numbers, to where it was unlikely that he was going to win the Heisman unless they had to run the offense a certain way. And you wouldn't want to be that if you were Ohio State, because that likely means you don't have as good of a defense as you do, and you're not as good of a team as you are right now, where Ohio State's still the favorite to win it all. Smith is impactful for no other reason than he's an alien and the best wide receiver in football, and no cornerback has an edge over him. You can't stop him. You can only slow him down. For Indiana, it's cornerback D'Angelo Pons, who's only 5'9", but covered Jeremiah Smith quite well, was one of the only corners who could cover Jeremiah Smith quite well. He is a day 2 pick for sure, I would say, and there might be a team where if they ignore his height can say, maybe we want him really early, because all he does is play well. He's fundamentally sound. There has not been a moment where he has a terrible play. His average is great. His best is NFL level corner play. And that matters because with Indiana and how their defense operates, the one thing that if you wanted to nitpick, you could say that they have not been the best at is busted plays. Usually deep passes and busted plays. I imagine that, as all good staffs do, they will try to fix their weaknesses over this long break. And having Pons means that one side of the field is pretty much locked down at all times. And you've played Oregon with healthy receivers. You've played Ohio State with their healthy receivers. Oklahoma does not have what they do. Alabama, in theory, does, but their offense for the entire season has not been as effective as Ohio State's, or especially Oregon's. Oregon is more balanced than the two. And Texas Tech does not have what either of those two teams did. So you have already faced some of the tougher passing offenses that you can, or that you could face. And with Pons as impactful as he is, you have an opportunity to make plenty of your opponents one-dimensional and force them to try to run against you. And no one runs against Indiana. Last but not least, we got Fernando Mendoza. Mendoza won the Heisman, first Heisman Trophy winner in Indiana history. 33 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. He is the best quarterback in the playoffs. It's either him or Dante Moore. And I am giving it to Sayan right now. Dante Moore would have to put together a few performances in the playoffs for me to say, okay, yeah, he's quarterback one. Mendoza, what's special about him is he can make every throw. Literally. His arm strength, check. His accuracy, check. His poise, check. The ability to run, check. The ability to take a hit and not be fazed by it, check. Now, is he the perfect quarterback? No. He could do a better job of not making errant throws, of handling pressure in the pocket better, of seeing the field better when he's under pressure. And his arm strength isn't, 100 out of 100. But we did see in the Big Ten championship game where you compared him and Julian Sayin, and Sayin is a really good quarterback and one of the best in college football. You did see that his arm is stronger than Sayin. He is more accurate than Sayin. He has better touch. He was just better in that game, he was better in every aspect than Sayin was. In some areas by quite a bit, in other areas by a little. But there wasn't really anything that Sayin was better at than Mendoza. And again, Sayin is a top 10 quarterback, has top 5 statistics. He's a top 10 or top 5 quarterback in college football. I'd probably go with top 10 right now. Fernando Mendoza's in that top 5. And that matters in the college football playoff because defense and quarterback play is usually what wins championships. We know Indiana has defense knocked down. I think it's pretty clear with Mendoza. They also have quarterback play knocked down. Some other players I didn't mention here, but if their teams begin to go on a run and these other teams in the playoff fix their weaknesses, Miami's Ruben Bain Jr., his impact can be maximized. Texas A&M's Cassius Howell, his impact can be maximized. For Alabama, I would say it's their receivers, Jeremy Bernard, Ryan Williams, for example. And for Oklahoma, I would go with probably Kip Lewis or one of their players on that defensive front. Those are the most impactful players in the college football playoff. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. And as for the college football playoff, I think it's important to talk about Blue Bloods. Blue Bloods are the teams in the sport who have won multiple titles, who've produced All-Americans, NFL players. These are teams that at one point or not have had dynasties. And I think with the 12-team playoff and its expansion, we can reasonably say that all of these teams, or at least the majority of them, should expect to participate in the college football playoff. They should. They should expect to be consistent contenders. If you are a college football blue blood, now that the playoff has expanded to 12 teams, and when it inevitably expands again, you should expect to compete for the playoffs and reach the playoffs every single season. The consensus blue bloods in college football are Michigan, Alabama, Nebraska, Notre Dame, Ohio State, Oklahoma, Texas, and USC. It's those 8. I personally would classify Penn State as a blue blood, personally. But that is not a consensus or unanimous opinion. That's kind of a fringe opinion with a lot of people. So with that in mind, just wanted to mention them. I think they are a team that should expect to make it more often than not. With how they've bungled the recent recruiting class, I think you probably should give them at least a grace year, but they should expect to consistently be contending for that playoff and making it. Anyway, I think all of these teams listed up here should expect to compete for the playoffs and be in it. So Alabama, you should make it every year. That's why last year was a failure. Michigan, you should make it every year. There are exceptions to every rule. I think with Michigan's schedule and how late Harbaugh left after 23, it was acceptable in 24 to barely miss it. But this year, no. And 99% of seasons, no. That's why this year was a failure for Michigan. Nebraska, I'm going to talk about them a little bit later. I think they're a bit of a special case here. But Notre Dame, you should make it every year with rare exception. Ohio State, you should make it every year with rare exception. Same thing with Oklahoma. Same thing with Texas. Same thing with USC. Now that Oklahoma has made it this year, from here on out with Venables, you should make it every year or close to that. If you miss it, you're going 9-3. You're not going 7-5 or 8-4. Same thing with all of these teams. The vast majority of them on this list are 9-3 or better, even with questions, because they're blue blood teams. People often joke about, USC always going 8-4, Michigan always going 8-4, Texas always going 8-4. A lot of those teams' lows are other teams' highs or baselines. Think about that. That's why they have blue blood running through their arteries and veins. When you cut them, they bleed blue. They bleed luxury. They bleed royalty. Michigan, Alabama, Ohio State, they have all won national titles on this list. Texas has made multiple CFP appearances. So has Oklahoma. So has Notre Dame. The only teams on this list who have not made a playoff appearance are USC, and in the BCS era, they won multiple national titles, and Nebraska, who in the BCS era had one national title game appearance, and before that won several national titles, 3 of them exactly, in the 1990s. So they have shown in modern college football history, like post-World War II, post-civil rights, and post-desegregation, these schools have showed that they can do it. Now, there are changes, of course, and there are limitations to each of them. No program, I think, in the post-NIL and post-transfer portal world is perfect, because it's harder to be invincible now than it was beforehand. But reaching the playoffs does not require you to be invincible. It kind of did in some instances in the 4-team playoff, especially when the field was strong and there were a lot of teams that had 11 or 12 wins. But with the 12-team playoff, an occasional 3-loss team can even slip in. And if you're 10-2 and have a respectable schedule, you will get in the college football playoff. I think that some people disagree with this, and I understand why. But I strongly believe that if you take a moment to ponder that argument and you look at the history of these teams even recently, you'll come to the same conclusion that I did. People will say, I've heard people talk about how Oklahoma or USC or Michigan or Nebraska or many of these other teams, like even Texas, should accept mediocrity because, well, that's what their past 10 years have been. But you're taking a intentionally small sample size and rolling with that. And most people who say that are talking about their competition. So I hear Ohio State and Michigan State fans a lot say that Michigan should not have high expectations. They're only saying that because if Michigan does have high expectations and lives up to them, there will be a year where, with how tough the Big Ten is, Michigan State will struggle or Ohio State will miss the playoffs 1 out of every 10 years because the field's just too strong. And eventually you will have to lose to someone. It's the same thing with when Oklahoma was good, or these other schools in the Big 12, Texas should just accept mediocrity. Well, that's because when Texas is good, those schools that are filling that void will get pushed towards a wall. Football's a competitive sport. Every program knows this. Every fan knows this intuitively in their subconscious. And if your team has more competition, we're seeing this with the SEC right now. The SEC is still the deepest conference, but because it's so competitive, they're eating each other up, and it's causing hell amongst all fan bases because they can't go undefeated anymore. No one feels invincible. Everyone feels on edge. It's also why the SEC is the best slate of games, because anyone can kind of lose to anyone if you're in the top half of the SEC or top 2/3. The Big Ten is getting closer to this. The ACC is this and will remain to be that way because in the post, opening of the portal world, you can't have 2018 Clemson anymore or 2013 Florida State. The Big 12 is kind of like this. Because of their lack of recruiting prowess, Texas Tech might be able to be invincible within the Big 12, but once they get to the playoffs, they're not going to be invincible. No one will be. So history matters. If we get to a salary cap era where it's totally like the NFL, then history may not matter, or it may matter only a little bit. But I think right now, where we're at, where these blue bloods, they have past history. They all have resources. All 8 of those schools have a resource edge over much of the college football playoff field. Even now, they have resource advantages over most of college football. Most of Tier 1 resource access. There are some others who I think are more in Tier 2. But none of these schools that I've brought up are in Tier 3. None of them are really struggling financially. All of these teams have recruited at a high level. They have brought in portal classes at a high level. All of them right now actually have winning seasons. Nebraska's been brought back into that conversation where they had their first winning regular season since 2016. So when you have resources, you have the past history, all of these schools, all of them are in the SEC or Big Ten now. So the top two conferences, you should expect to, on an annual basis, be in the playoffs every year. And look, you don't get fired for failing one out of every 10 years. You don't. So sometimes these teams will miss. It'll be like, yeah, it was a failure, but we're not going to make staff changes because that's just the nature of the sport. Elite staffs now won't always win 11 games or 12 games. That's not going to happen anymore. Again, there are some caveats that we'll get to, but before we get to them, I want to suggest that the reason these schools are not where they have been at different points is coaching. So the perfect examples of this, I think, are USC and Michigan in particular, Nebraska too. So why did Michigan in the 21st century fall off? Was it because they were always overrated and always overvalued, and really they're just a mediocre program who should lose to Ohio State 50 out of 50 years, as some people literally will say on social media? Well, no. And those people are biased morons. The real reason is because Ohio State made better hires and Ohio State did more with its infrastructure than Michigan did. You see, a lot of the reasons these blue blood schools have failed, and this is what's funny, they aren't for inherent reasons. They are for very meritocratic reasons. Ohio State is a better program than Michigan because Ohio State has made better decisions than Michigan has. Oklahoma, for much of the 2010s, was so far ahead of Texas despite similar past history. So far ahead. And I think Oklahoma has a better history than Michigan than Texas in general. Michigan, too, in modern football. Like, Oklahoma is at the top end of the blue blood spectrum in modern college football history due to, their dominance in, like, most of the 20th century, and they won the first national championship of the 21st century. They've been in several playoff games and BCS national title games of the 21st century. It's a proud program. But they were that far ahead of Texas because Texas made some really dumb and stupid decisions and bad choices, and Oklahoma did not. So that, on one hand, is humiliating because often that means a lot of these blue bloods are rivals of each other. So that means you have to accept your rival was smarter than you. That's humiliating. Or that another school that has similar resources to you is so much better than you because they made better decisions and investment. But it's also comforting because then if you make as good of decisions as they do, you can be on their level. And we've seen this with USC. USC had kind of a mini dynasty going on before Saban's dynasty. That was because of the decisions USC and Pete Carroll made while Pete Carroll was their head coach and the situation that they were in. They have since fallen off, and they made bad decisions like Lane Kiffin, Steve Sarkisian, Clay Helton. Lincoln Riley's to be determined. I think he will be better than those three. We'll see if he can get them anywhere close to that Pete Carroll level. It'll be hard in this new era, but if they're just consistently making the playoffs, I mean, how would Pete Carroll do? How would 2000s Pete Carroll do in this modern era with more of the restrictions and competitive balance than what existed back then? Michigan with Jim Harbaugh, it started out rough, but towards the end, things got better and momentum picked up. With Nebraska, we haven't seen that, but we've seen glimpses of it where Scott Frost and Mike Riley were not as equipped to be competent coaches as Matt Rule is. No coincidence that Matt Rule's program trajectory, even with Raiola entering the portal, is up or at least plateaued, and Riley's and Frost's was usually always down, or it was plateaued but so close to the floor that it didn't matter that they were staying level. They still weren't winning anything of significance or even remotely competitive when it mattered most. Some positive exceptions to this rule. So these are schools that aren't blue bloods, but should have blue blood-like expectations because of their circumstances. Definitely Oregon, Texas, Miami, and Georgia. I think at this point, Miami is the only school outside of the SEC and Big Ten, the Big Two, that should expect to reach the playoffs every year. They have such a coaching and development and recruiting edge over everyone in that conference to where not going 10-2 is an absolute failure. Like losing 3 regular season games is catastrophic for them. Going 10-2 is probably just, yeah, that's what we expect now. They should, with where they're positioned, always make the playoffs and win the ACC in similar fashion that Clemson and Florida State were winning it at different streaks in the 2010s. Oregon and Texas just spend so much and have accumulated so much roster talent that they should be in that conversation every single year. And both, under their current coaches, have made the playoff 2 times. Texas made the 14 playoff. Oregon was very close in 23. Oregon has been a top half seed in the 12-team playoff for 2 years in a row, and Texas received a top half bid and would have received a first-round bye if the current playoff rules were applied in 2024. They missed it this year, but they went 9-3, and that was a failure of a year for Texas. And then with Kirby Smart and how Georgia's operating, they're not a blue blood, but they're very close to it. So they should expect to be there every year with the coach that Kirby Smart is. With how Texas Tech and Indiana have performed this year, with how Indiana's performed under Cignetti, and with how Tech is killing the Big 12 with resources, I think Tech could be in a Miami situation where you're just so far above the rest of the conference that you should expect to cruise to 11 wins every year. And conference championship week determines whether or not you get in or where you get seated. And for Indiana, it's the idea that Cignetti's made it 2 years in a row. They don't have any permanent rivals outside of Purdue, so they're not going to be facing one of the top-end schools every single year. Like, they don't have a rivalry, an annual rivalry with the top-end schools. They're not scheduling hard unless they're forced to. And Cignetti right now, I think, has the best staff in football. And they've been able to develop a lot of these lower-end recruits into day 2, day 3 NFL draft picks. So they should expect to be in that conversation, especially if in the postseason they defy the expectation of many and they go on a run and they defy the blue chip ratio. Like, at that point, they're now a power. Totally. And I think already they kind of are. And they should be in that boat and have those expectations. That's a lot of teams who should expect to reach the playoff every year. We've counted, if you include Indiana and Texas Tech, we've counted 14 teams that should expect to be there every year. The playoff will probably expand to 16 sooner rather than later, but even if it doesn't, this is a competitive sport, and in competitive sports, someone always has to fail given their expectations, which means, everyone, like in competitive sports, ideally everyone should have high expectations. And therefore, because there aren't enough trophies to give out to everyone, and, everyone has to play each other, so someone's got to lose, someone's going to have to fail. So not everything's cookie cutter in this sport. Not everyone can be happy. And I think that also doesn't help the conversation, where some people who say, oh, these programs should be happy, underachieving, some of them aren't even saying that probably out of bias, but out of the idea that they're trying to find an equilibrium of the sport. And there really isn't one in regards to which teams get in, which teams do not. There are rare exceptions like Ohio State, the most successful program, most consistent program since World War II, but they're an exception to the rule. And with how college football works and with how everyone's had down periods, it wouldn't shock me if in like 50 years Ohio State's as a 6-6 year or something. Like, it's a long ways down the line, but nothing is guaranteed in this sport. The one negative exception that I would have is Nebraska. Nebraska, how do I put this? They're out in the middle of nowhere. They've had losing season after losing season. The most wins they've earned in a regular season in about a decade has been 7. and they're in a tough conference with several blue bloods that have had more recent success than they have. USC, Michigan, Penn State, Ohio State. Oregon's a new blood, and they're in the conference. Indiana is trending towards being a new blood. They are pretty much, for at least the next 1 year or 2 years, blocked from being in the top 6. I think for Nebraska, you should expect to get to a point where you are consistently competing for the playoffs, but until you're there, you cannot expect to make the playoffs every year. It's got to be a limited expectation where we just want to get better every year, and at some point, if we continue to get better every year, we will be an annual playoff contender, and at that point, maybe you can expect to try and reach the playoffs every year or every other year. Bit of an exception with them that I think is very appropriate given the type of team they have been, the type of team they are, and the fact that compared to all of these teams, they are the most behind in terms of being a top 10, top 15 team, and they have the most rebuilding to do. Whew, that was a really fun segment, if I gotta be honest. That was incredibly enjoyable. Do we have any super chats in here? Doesn't look like it, no, but our concurrent viewers are growing. Thank you to Moody Meatball and Armand Hammer for being moderators and helping to keep this chat enjoyable and fun. Let's move on and talk about some expectations for the Michigan State Spartans. What are Michigan State's expectations with Pat Fitzgerald leading the program and their current roster and schedule outlook for 2026? I believe that Michigan State should expect to be competitive. They should expect to be, what's the word outside of competitive? Physical. They should reach a bowl game, and they should upgrade their roster, and they should be spending. Michigan State needs to act like a top 25 program, as that's what they are. And they need to upgrade their roster, compete for a bowl spot, and they need to show that they are competitive in the biggest moments, things that they have failed to do under Jonathan Smith and under Mel Tucker. When you look at this schedule for Michigan State, Toledo, Eastern Michigan, at Notre Dame, road games in Big Ten play. They haven't been scheduled or assigned dates yet, but Michigan, Rutgers, UCLA, and Wisconsin on the road, and Illinois, Nebraska, Northwestern, Oregon, and Washington at home. There's a lot of opportunity here for Michigan State, where just looking at this, I think Notre Dame is an automatic loss. I think Oregon is an automatic loss. But because of circumstances at every other school, especially with Michigan being a rivalry, Michigan not having a head coach at the time of this recording, Michigan State has 10 games that I could say are winnable. I think they could probably win 8 out of those 10 best case scenario. And at worst case scenario, you win 4 out of those 10. Kind of thinking 4-8 to 8-4 is the range for Michigan State intuitively going off this schedule. Now, that will change with portal additions, how certain players pan out in spring ball, in fall camp, how development goes, how the remaining staff hirings and firings and that change of the guard goes, and also how this schedule is assigned. So if there's a tough run where, say, Oregon, Washington, Nebraska, and Michigan are all in a row, that is a run where, because those teams are that talented and Michigan State's rebuilding, that could really take the air out of the tires for Michigan State and really cause some damage, for example. So still a lot of variation, I think, with expectations, which is why I'm not really focusing on record. I have a record in mind that Michigan State should expect for year one under Pat Fitzgerald, but we'll get to that towards the end. I got to think about it just a little bit more. But one thing I know that Michigan State should expect is playing sound defense, tackling well, covering well, being in the right position, and having a defensive line that actually matters. Michigan State has not put together a competent defense since either 2021, but I don't think that was fundamentally sound. I just think they had a really talented group of front 7, front six players, you probably would have to go back to 2019 to find a sound Michigan State defense. It has been over half a decade, and that's what Michigan State's program prides itself on, historically, in recent memory, is they lead with defense, and it makes sense. Teams that are competitive for championships, for the playoffs, that win their conference, that are not blue chip ratio teams that don't recruit majority 4 and 5 star players, typically win with defense, usually. As Michigan State did with Mark D'Antonio. They had some teams with wonderful offensive players and wonderful offenses, 2014, for example. But they led with defense, whether it was Pat Narduzzi, whether it was Mike Tressel and company. Defense was their identity. Think of Michigan under Jim Harbaugh. What was the better side of the football? Especially for the teams that went on to win the Big Ten, reach the playoffs, or that competed for something of great significance. The defense. Whether that was Don Brown before he was figured out, or Mike McDonald, or Jesse Minter. Ohio State under Ryan Day, the best teams he had that won it all or were competing for it in truth were teams that had the better defenses. 2021 Ohio State didn't reach the playoffs and wasn't going to with that defense, even though that was probably Day's best offense. 2022 Ohio State almost was the exception to the rule, with a healthy offense probably being the best in the nation. They just couldn't stay healthy, and the defense was, all right, not great. But you get the point. We've seen this in the Big Ten. We've seen this with Saban's Alabama, with Kirby Smart's Georgia. Michigan State's got to play sound defense. They got to upgrade their roster defensively in the portal. I think retaining Joe Rossi was the right move. Bringing in the defensive line coach and linebackers coaches they did, Winston DeLatabore and not Cal Halliday, Max Bulla. I, for whatever reason, got them mixed up, but forgive me on that front. Bulla being a far better linebacker than Halliday, and also being one of the better linebacker coaches in college football, as his time with Notre Dame showed us. I think they're on track to doing that. But something that's harder to do, it builds off of having sound defense, is showing fight in 12 games. By fight, I don't mean you play everyone within a possession. That's not going to happen with, more likely than not, Notre Dame or Oregon. You never know. But likely those are going to be pretty hefty losses. By fight, I mean your players are still trying, even if they're down by 21 or 28 points. And against teams that are not at the top of the sport, you are playing in one-score games. You are able to put together sustainable drives. When you build a big lead, as Michigan State did several times this past season, or just built a lead, you don't blow it away all the time. You hold strong. They've quit several times too, the Spartans have, since 2022. I can count 2022 Minnesota. I can count 2022 Indiana. 2023 for much of the year, the Washington game, the Rutgers game late, the Penn State game, although that was understandable because the roster was super banged up. In 2024, the Rutgers game, that was a total no-show. And UCLA this past year, that was an absolute no-show. And even for games against Maryland or Iowa or Minnesota, where they blew leads to bad teams. And I don't know if Maryland really wanted to be there in Ford Field. Maryland kind of feels like a dead program right now. That has to stop. That's bottom 50 program behavior, FBS-wise. Michigan State's a top 25 program, FBS-wise. You can't have that. Something that I believe Fitzgerald will understand that Smith did not, but just want to quickly go over this point. They need to understand the rivalry against Michigan, and that has to be a priority. Michigan State needs to view Michigan as their magnificent obsession, in the same way that Michigan and Ohio State view each other. That's the intensity that Michigan State needs to bring to the Michigan State rivalry. And, easier said than done, but upgrade the roster. Develop better than Smith's staff did. Recruit better players in the portal. Evaluate better players. And you know what? If you got to win ugly, win ugly. It's just the reality. With the new Big Ten, it's going to be tougher for Michigan State to break through now than it was when D'Antonio was there because the conference is better. It's deeper. Michigan isn't as down as they were. Penn State might be as down as they were, but that could also just be a one-year fluke. And Ohio State is as good as they were then. Some would argue even better. I would actually argue relative to the new expectations of the new era, they probably are in better standing than they were in the early 2010s, mid-2010s. And Oregon exists. USC exists. You get the point, right? So they got to develop, they got to use the portal, and hopefully they can recruit at a good enough level to find diamonds in the roughs or some blue chip players to help them along the way. And last but not least, a little bit too early for a record expectation, but I think that 5 to 6 wins should be around what the expectation is, where you're either very close to a bowl game and you miss it without quitting and you just have a ton of bad close losses. We're not like choke close losses, but you just didn't have the players to get through. Or you go bowling. Like somewhere around that ballpark, I think should be year one expectations. Now year two, where the staff typically has its biggest impact, and now you've stacked a few portal classes and high school recruiting classes, that should be better than 5 or 6 wins. At that point, you're talking about probably 7 wins, maybe 8 wins, but definitely a winning season. Please keep in mind, though, it is year one, and he's inheriting a roster that was built in part by Mel Tucker, mostly by Jonathan Smith, and neither Smith nor Tucker did a great job. Michigan State now has several regimes in a row where they have set a bad precedent. So it's going to be hard to break out of. I think that Michigan State will fulfill a lot of these expectations in year one just from a very early look, but that's where I think the bar should be set for the Spartans in 2026 is be competitive, find a postseason appearance, never quit, and play better defense and just be more fundamentally sound. It's been very sickening and disappointing watching Michigan State's lack of fundamental soundness in their first few regimes. That's been rather bothersome. But we'll get to some more Michigan State talk, and actually we'll also get to some Nebraska expectations that I want to discuss. But there is an important conversation surrounding the college football playoff that I think needs to be discussed, and that is Oregon and what their receivers could do for the college football playoff, for their college football playoff appearance. The difference between a healthy Oregon and an unhealthy Oregon is quite vast, and I think almost was about to sneeze, so I just wanted to stop myself from sneezing. It's pretty annoying when that happens. The difference between a healthy Oregon wide receiver core and a banged up Oregon wide receiver core could be the difference between Oregon hoisting their first national championship trophy or the difference between them losing to Texas Tech in the Orange Bowl. Let me explain why. So Dante Moore is a first-round NFL quarterback. He'll probably leave after the playoffs, but I never want to say that he's already gone before he makes that decision. Oregon might have the best offensive line in the playoffs. I think their O-line is the highest ceiling in the playoffs and one of the higher floors, but Indiana or Georgia could have something to say about that. But it's one of the best in the playoffs. Their tight end group has aliens. Their running back room is exceptionally deep for how young it is. Wide receiver is the only missing piece. And we've seen, whether it was against a much better Penn State team than we saw for much of the year, or whether it was against Indiana at times, more so in the first half, where a healthy Oregon offense can move the football sustainably against great defenses. And they're going to need to move the ball against great defenses if they want to win the national championship. The team is already fantastic, not just offensively, but they're top 4 in power ratings, if not top 3. You also look at how defensively they've been able to stop the run. They've been able to limit opposing passing attacks. Their special teams is better than it was last year, particularly their kicking game. And Oregon with a healthy receiver core, they would not be perfect. I don't think Oregon with healthy receivers would likely be the best team in the college football playoff. I still think that Indiana, Georgia, and Ohio State would be better, but Oregon would be even closer to them, and they're already close. They'd be within margin of error to where maybe I am wrong. Maybe with healthy receivers, they could be the best team in the playoffs, and they could win it all. And this matters because the Ducks, with an explosive rushing attack, averaging 6.31 yards per carry, with an offensive line that protects a fantastic quarterback in Dante Moore, defenses have to game plan for this offense. This offense can do, it's not as multiple as Indiana's, it's not as multiple as Georgia's, but they can attack you in a lot of different ways. And one thing they are number one at, I think Indiana has the most diverse offense and can attack you in just about every way. Georgia would be next on that list. What Oregon is the best at is explosive plays, explosive runs, explosive passes. They are the most explosive offense in this college football playoff. That's one thing they're good at. And what can help either give them the ability to be more sustainable and create more sustained drives or be even more explosive is having a deep wide receiver room to where you don't just have to pay attention to the run game or the O-line or Kenyon Sadiq or Jeremiah McClellan, who's come on nicely. Same thing with Malik Benson. Now you got to worry about Brycen Moore and Gary Bryant Jr. and maybe if he can come back, Evan Stewart. Look at the difference in how Oregon, not healthy, would match up with the entire field with wide receiver versus DB. And compare that to what, with a healthy receiver core, what they could do with a, again, against the field with defensive backs in the playoffs. So they have an edge over these opposing defensive backs if they're not healthy. Like if Brycen Moore and Gary Bryant and Evan Stewart are out. You probably have an edge over James Madison and Texas A&M, maybe Miami. You will not have an edge over Ohio State or Georgia or Indiana or Texas Tech or Alabama or Oklahoma if they somehow get that far. I'm not counting Ole Miss because I do not think Ole Miss has a shot at beating Georgia. Same thing with Tulane. That's it. The others, maybe some could be debatable. Others, you definitely would have a disadvantage in the air attack there. But with Brycen Moore and Gary Bryant and Evan Stewart, totally healthy. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle as to what Oregon will field in the playoffs. I think you would have an advantage over every defensive back group except for Indiana, Alabama, Ohio State, and Georgia. And some of those are maybes. Some of those, like Igmanosin for Ohio State, it'd be hard for any receiver to beat him. But it's not impossible, and Jermaine Matthews is short enough and has had enough iffy games to where I think one of Oregon's receivers could beat him. For Alabama, I think they probably have the best secondary in America, so probably not them. With Indiana, you could probably, with your explosiveness, this happened earlier this year when they got Indiana with a Malik Benson explosive. He had a deep route, and Indiana didn't read the play properly, and he was able to get into the end zone. You could probably find an explosive against Indiana, as one of their nitpicked weaknesses is they kind of give up an explosive pass play once per game. For Georgia's secondary has improved in recent weeks, but I don't know if that's only because of them or because Alabama has regressed and Texas has offensive limitations. I think it's a little bit of both, that their secondary has improved, but Alabama also is not as good as they were when they played Georgia that first time. That's still a huge difference, though. And healthy, even though you may not have an edge over those four teams in the air attack, you won't be shut down like you could be if you were not healthy at receiver against those teams. Oregon, with their receivers back, has a much better chance at winning it all and is probably one of the most, if not the most, undervalued team in the playoff with healthy receivers. Without healthy receivers, though, the Orange Bowl will be a tough out. It might even be a tough few quarters or drives against James Madison, and I have a hard time seeing them advance past the semifinals if none of their receivers are healthy. Just, you need balance. You need a multiple offense and defense. Oregon has the defense, but you need diversity and different modes of attack to win these games. And if Oregon does not have healthy receivers, they don't have that. They don't. Someone said I uploaded a video while live. I don't think I did, but let me check. No, I didn't upload a video while live. Someone in the chat said I did, but if you if you think I did, you must have gotten a late notification, because I did not upload a video while live. I did not. So, just wanted to provide an answer on that. Bless me. Okay, where are we in the show? Where are we? Okay, we're right here. Okay, cool. Well, make sure to like, make sure to subscribe, make sure to hit the notification bell so that you can get notified when we go live Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at noon Eastern time. I know for much of my previous scheduled live shows, I have not been on time. This week right now, though, we have been pretty much on time, if not close to it. So we're going to follow this really for the rest of the year and for the rest of the preseason, too. Like, this will be the schedule up until next year, at which point I probably will change it because I would like to have at least a day off per week. So I'd probably move the Friday stream up to Thursday, maybe try to go live 4 days a week again. We'll see, though. But this is going to be the schedule from here on out for the rest of the preseason. So really, December, January, February, March, April, May, June, July. It's going to be the schedule for the next 8 or 9 months, guys. Will be Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at noon Eastern time. Let's talk about some playoff or bust teams in 2026. Do a little bit of 2026 talk, as all but really 12 teams have their seasons ended, unless you're like BYU, Georgia Tech, Iowa, Vanderbilt. Maybe you could even say Texas and Michigan, although Michigan's season, I would say, is over since their coaching staff is going to go under a reset, where most teams are already moving on to next year and looking forward to next year. So I want to start talking about that. And I think there isn't a greater place to start off than talking about teams that are playoff or bust for this season. Who are teams that missed the college football playoff in 2025 that need to make it in 2026 if they want to call their season a success and if they want to continue to head in the right direction and or keep their coach and current regime from being on the hot seat or the word fired being used around them? Well, most of these teams, I think, are regimes, are programs that have recruited well, whether this year, here are just the current 2026 recruiting class rankings, they've either currently recruited well or they have recruited well in recent memory. So they usually have rosters that are made up of half or more blue chip players, and they are bringing a lot back. Most of them have staff continuity. They have good rosters. They play in great conferences. Some have scheduling advantages. Really, the only central key to this expectation where these teams that miss this year have to make it next year, have to compete for a national title or at least reach the playoff, are teams that are well into rebuilds or well into their regime, and they have also recruited well. First and foremost, USC. Lincoln Riley's in year 5. I would add a caveat and say that you could technically argue it's year 3, because the first 2 years with Alex Grinch was its own thing, because that's a major identity that he had, where Grinch was his guy on defense, and that defense that Grinch ran was the defense he ran at Oklahoma. And then he had a major break from that. And I would argue that was an entirely new chapter of Lincoln Riley. But even in year 3 at USC, you should reach the playoffs with those resources, with that recruiting, with the fact that he's bringing back Jaden Mayava. If he didn't bring back Jaden Mayava, I might actually lower the expectations. But bringing back Mayava, along with much of that defensive roster, much of the running back room, the offensive line, and the reputation they have at receiver, tells me this is a team who can compete for the playoffs for sure, and maybe even compete for going on a run or winning it all if everything pans out. So for that reason, USC, despite their tough schedule, that doesn't matter because they are a blue blood program with a great coach in year 5, with a great staff, and they are returning a veteran unit, a veteran core on defense, a little bit less so on offense, but still on the offensive line and quarterback. You'd expect them to somewhat reload at wide receiver. And I like where they are at as a program. So it's time for them to take that next step. Texas. USC wasn't totally expected to reach the playoffs this year. I think they had a successful year in 2025. They just have to then take that next step and parlay that into a successful year in 26, which means winning 10 games instead of 9, for example. Texas was expected to be in this playoff this year. I even expected them to be. And no, they're not even a top 10 team at the end of the year. They're a top 15 team in power ratings. They regressed majorly from where they were last year. Got worse on defense, got worse on offense. Special teams got better, though. And that's an encouraging thing. I think it shows that their staff accurately assessed a weakness and improved there. Texas brings back an NFL quarterback in Arch Manning, who towards the end of the year looked pretty phenomenal. They'll have a more veteran offensive line and defensive line than they did this year, and they have one of the better staffs in college football. They also have a top 4 roster in terms of talent. They've been recruiting well, they've been developing well, so they have to make the playoffs next year. Absolutely. This year was already a failure. Next year would be a catastrophic failure and probably put some hot seat talk or warm seat talk around the Texas program and their coaching staff if they were to once again miss the playoffs next year. Tennessee, this is getting a little bit murky now, just a little bit murky. I think Texas and USC are definitely playoff or bust teams. Tennessee's a little murky, but I think they fit the bill because of how the 2025 season ended, where Vanderbilt humiliated them. They lost to Oklahoma at home. They were competitive against Georgia, but back when Georgia was much worse than they are now, and they never competed with Alabama. They, with what they bring back, with what they bring in terms of recruiting, it's their best recruiting class in a minute. I expect that they might use the portal a little bit more than they did last year. Their roster is improved. Jim Knowles is replacing Tim Banks, and I know the whole, well, Jim Knowles takes a long time to implement a system. He does. But we've seen at Ohio State and Oklahoma State and Duke that in his first year there, it improves from the prior regime because he is one of the better defensive coordinators in college football. I don't think their defense is going to be elite next year, but it's not going to be outside of the top 50 like it was this year. It'll be around probably a top 25 unit. That's what my expectation is, as it was for Ohio State in 2022, where, guys, you shouldn't expect a top 10 defense with how bad that, side of the ball was recruited. You shouldn't expect that. You should expect a top 25, top 20 unit. And that's what it was, where its talent, lack thereof, just failed the scale against Georgia and Michigan because those teams were really good. That's what Tennessee's going to be like. That's what they should expect to be like, where your offense with Heupel and with that system should be good. Just improve the defense, and you can probably find 9 or 10 wins and be in that playoff conversation. Michigan is murky as well. But if they can retain that roster and upgrade the coaching staff, and it's almost, I would say, a definite that they will upgrade the coaching staff, depending on how that sorts out, they will then have one of the most talented rosters in football with a coaching staff that actually can keep their pants on, because Moore couldn't. They'll have a veteran offensive line, an upgraded staff, Bryce Underwood in year 2, much better receivers, I would expect, and just a better staff overall. The schedule's tougher than it was last year, yes, but it's not so much tougher that if Michigan upgrades, they're going to be in the same position. Oklahoma, for example, is going to be a much more winnable game next year than it was this year. Penn State, Michigan State at home, if you upgrade your staff, you should beat those teams. Indiana at home, and then Ohio State and Oregon on the road, those are going to be very, very tough. And it's why I don't think Michigan missing the playoffs next year would be a total bust. So this is very murky. In fact, maybe they shouldn't even be on the list. But if they want to call the season a total success and really jumpstart the next regime, then yeah, you should make the playoffs next year and beat one of Oregon, Ohio State, or Indiana, which I think with an upgraded staff could be doable. Again, though, this is the murkiest option here. Like if Texas and USC miss the playoffs next year, especially for Texas, it's a gut punch. For Tennessee, it's a disappointment. For Michigan, it's just you don't feel terrible, but you don't feel amazing either. You probably just feel okay or good or satisfied. LSU is, I think, back up to kind of Texas level, where with Kiffin, with him retaining Blake Baker as DC, with a likely upgraded quarterback spot, and with an upgraded roster, they should be able to make the playoffs in year 1. And if you don't, that's a gut punch, where we brought this guy in to hopefully win us a title and reach the playoffs in year 1, and our non-con isn't that tough because Clemson is down bad as a program, and our schedule's tough, but it's the SEC, and Kiffin has won a lot of games at Ole Miss, and he'll have a better roster and more access to talent this year than he did ever at Ole Miss. So why can't we reach the playoffs? That is absolutely a playoff or bust team. And last but not least is Notre Dame. Notre Dame has some of the easiest scheduling ever for a program, especially now that all the leagues are moving up to 9 games, and you're not going to see them play a lot of SEC or top-end Big Ten teams anymore because there's not much incentive for them. The incentive really only exists for Notre Dame there, unless rules change. They should make it because they have an easy schedule. Their offensive line with Joe Rudolph will always be elite, or at least flirting with that. And they got C.J. Carr, a really good quarterback. They must make it because of how this year ended, where I know they were in that conversation for a while and they got kicked out. Their strength of schedule, though, is weak. So if next year they have 10-2 record, where they lose to Miami and USC, and they beat no one of significance, they will not be in again. And I know the whole, well, if they're ranked inside the top 12, they must be in. Well, then they'll just be ranked 13th. That's where they'll be ranked because of how the strength of schedule metrics and honoring the head-to-head works. If they lose to Miami and USC next year and go 10-2, odds are USC and Miami would also be 10-2, and a bunch of other teams would be 10-2 or 11-1 or 12-0. Or, like 12-1, 11-2, whatever. There'd be so many teams that would have better resumes than Notre Dame, and they'd be kicked out again. In order for Notre Dame, with the way they schedule to reach the playoffs, they have to go 11-1. If they schedule tough, then they can go 10-2 and they'll be automatically in. So with how that season ended, it'd be a gut punch and an absolute failure and kind of a joke for them to not make the playoffs next year. Those are my, I'd say 4, 5, 6 playoff or bust teams for 2026. You could probably remove Michigan or Tennessee off the list if you wanted to, but I wanted to include them on there. Those are some teams who would love to make the playoffs next year, or they absolutely need to make the playoffs next year, and none of them made it this season. Some other things to talk about: best quarterbacks in the playoff. We'll do this one pretty quickly. These 4 quarterbacks will be difference makers in the college football playoff and some of the best players on their roster. These quarterbacks, Trinidad Chambliss, Julian Sayin, Dante Moore, and Fernando Mendoza, are some of the best players on their team, some of the best players in the college football playoff, and players that can have the it factor and really bring their team to victory and help them win a playoff game, or, I don't know. I don't know how to phrase it other than these quarterbacks will be difference makers in the college football playoff. Let's start off talking about Trinidad Chambliss really quickly. Trinidad Chambliss might be the best player on Ole Miss's entire team. And I think if they are to even compete with Georgia, and if they are to beat Tulane, which should be a closer game than it was in the regular season, then Trinidad Chambliss is going to have to play at a very high level and be engaged. Is he? Because I know he's probably thinking about his future and the transfer portal. So is he engaged? And what does Ole Miss's staff do? What position do they put him in? And what does his supporting cast look like in that game against Tulane? And if they win that game, as I think they should and will, what does it look like against Georgia? I don't know. But what I do know is that Trinidad Chambliss, because of his accuracy, his mobility, the fact that he does not turn the football over with only 3 interceptions, and that he has a top 10 QBR, will not be the reason why Ole Miss loses a single game. And he will be the reason why they are competitive in any of the games they play in. Julian Sayin, 6 interceptions, 31 passing touchdowns. I was considering whether or not him or Gunnar Stockton should be on here. But I decided to put Sayin on here because I think Sayin has more upside as a player. He set the record in the regular season for completion percentage. He has over 3,000 passing yards. He's a great quarterback. Sayin's strength is that when things are going well with his supporting cast, which is one of the better supporting casts in America, well, he's perfect. When things are not going so well, he exponentially drops off and at times can even become somewhat of a liability. I think that he is one of the best quarterbacks in the playoffs because of his numbers, his film, his quick release, his accuracy, and the fact that he really, he does a good job handling pressure unless it's overwhelming, I would say. So some players just don't handle pressure well at all. Others handle all of it great, and you'd prefer to be the latter. But we've seen Sayin before where he's faced pressure and has still done a phenomenal job because it's just pressure, and it's not like it's coming from every direction, or the secondaries he's playing are not elite, and he's able to still deliver the ball accurately and find his guys. He's helped a lot by his receivers, a lot by his left tackle. I still think he's one of the better players in the playoff and one of the better quarterbacks too. It helps that in most of the games he's played in, where other quarterbacks would take sacks, he's able to scramble around and use his feet and extend the play. Not in a rushing threat way, but in a, I'm going to maneuver around the pocket and give my offensive line and offense time to figure out the defense. It didn't work against Indiana, but Indiana is one of the top defenses in the sport, so I don't exactly blame him for that. For Dante Moore, had similar issues to Sayin in that regard with figuring out some of the top defenses and sometimes relying too much on the supporting cast. But Dante Moore, I would say, has a better arm than Sayin, has more upside, and he's viewed as a first-round quarterback by most in the industry. 24 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. He does have some mobility to him when healthy. What I love about Dante Moore is the arm strength, how he's progressed throughout the year. He looked fantastic earlier in the year. In October, he kind of had a bit of a slump. In November, he's really played like a high-caliber athlete, an NFL quarterback. Where that Washington game, I was impressed with him, where Washington sold out to stop Oregon's rushing attack. It helped limit what Oregon's offense could do, and yet him and his receivers were still able to connect enough to beat Washington by double digits and actually win and cover that game and that spread. The most impactful quarterback and the best quarterback in the playoffs, I think, is Fernando Mendoza. Mendoza won the Heisman. He has a lot of the upside that Dante Moore does with a higher floor. And his command of the offense, his connection with his receivers, his accuracy deep down the field, it's incredible. There's a reason why he's considered round 1, pick 1 in the NFL draft. And what I love about him is not just the measurables, it's not just the traits, it's the gutsiness, where he's willing to take hits, he's willing to deliver the ball downfield, he's willing to take risks. They don't always pay off, but sometimes they do. And he doesn't handle pressure I mean, none of these quarterbacks are really experts at handling pressure. But then again, most quarterbacks are not experts at handling pressure. So sometimes he'll make a mistake here or there. But he, completing over 70% of his throws, leading the nation, passing touchdowns. He runs that Indiana offense extremely well and can be a threat on the ground with his legs. He is the best quarterback in the playoffs, and he's a big part of the reason why Indiana is top 2 in odds to win the national championship. Those are the biggest difference makers at quarterback in the college football playoff. Some honorable mentions, I would say Gunnar Stockton for Georgia, and I would also say Marcel Reed or Carson Beck for Texas A&M and Miami, respectively. Okay, now speaking of more playoff conversation, want to explain why Oklahoma, in my opinion, will beat Alabama. The Oklahoma Sooners are 1.5-point underdogs to the Alabama Crimson Tide this Friday night. I have picked Oklahoma to win. I'm fairly convinced that Oklahoma will win, and I want to explain why this is. The biggest point that I have to offer up is their defense against what Alabama wants to do offensively. So let's take a look at Oklahoma's defense here. Really dive deep into it because almost all my reasons why I think Oklahoma wins this game relates to their defense. Just to get the offensive part of the way, John Mateer and Isaiah Sategna are good for one big play per game. And Sategna is a really good receiver with almost 1,000 receiving yards. And Mateer is a good enough quarterback with his legs, with Fasusi protecting him. And I expect him to be healthier now than he ever has been since that, hand injury that he suffered. I think that they are good for maybe one or two big plays offensively and producing enough offense with potential turnovers to score in the 20s for Oklahoma. But that's really it for their offense. Defensively, look at all of these metrics where they're first in yards per carry, they're first in season sacks, they are fourth in efficiency, only behind Texas Tech, Indiana, and Ohio State there. They are sixth in points per play allowed. They are third in rushing yards allowed per game. Their pass defense has been quite suspect at times. We've seen that against Ole Miss. We saw it against Texas a little bit. But this defense it's insane. And their rushing success rate allowed, 27.1%. They're first there. Their havoc rate generated is third at 18.9%. Their passing success rate allowed is 11th. Their expected points added per dropback is 7th. Their overall yards per play allowed, most of these stats that I'm now throwing at you are from GameOnPaper.com. Yards per play allowed, 4.8. And when you look at their adjusted EPA per play allowed, it's second in the FBS, first in the Power 4. This is an incredible defense, and a defense that I like against this Alabama team because Alabama can't stop the run, and they have had issues protecting their quarterback. They have had huge issues, with Caden Proctor allowing a ton of pressures, with the middle of the offensive line having a really hard time, not just solely protecting the quarterback, but more so getting any footing in the ground game. Their offensive line has had a litany of issues. Alabama, for context, in yards per carry, they are 125th, averaging 4.1 yards per carry. Their rushing success rate is it's awful. It is so bad that it is 131st rushing success rate. Their havoc rate allowed, Alabama's, is 13th, but I think a lot of that in part is overinflated. I think it's a little bit of an inflated havoc rates because Simpson, for much of the year until recently, was good at taking care of the football. They don't really fumble the football away, and their O-line it's just good, but it is lacking in areas where you would want it to be in, where they have talent there, but a lot of that raw talent is what makes them good. There hasn't been a lot of coaching or development there, I don't think, on that offensive line. For the Crimson Tide, they are competent at passing the football, but recently that's even been shaky. It has been with, the Oklahoma game, the LSU game, the Auburn game, the Georgia game, the South Carolina game. They've been shaky. And I think that with this type of defense, that Oklahoma can really get after it here. And with R. Mason Thomas hopefully healthy, and Jaden Jackson, Dominic Williams, David Stone, Grayson Halton, with Marvin Jones Jr., with Taylor Ween, I think they have more depth on the D-line than they did at the beginning of the year. And I think their D-line will absolutely maul Alabama's offensive line. Kip Lewis, Kobe McKenzie, Owen Heineke, Sammy Omosigho. They have a deep linebacker core. This defensive front is absolutely going to abuse Alabama's offensive front. And keep in mind that Brent Venables is 2-0 against Kalen DeBoer, and in both games he shut down and destroyed Alabama's offense. DB against Alabama's receivers is a problem. I think that Isaiah Horton, Ryan Williams, Jeremy Bernard each have matchup edges over Oklahoma's corners and their safeties, but not enough to compensate for that defensive front. And with how Simpson's been inaccurate and late, and the fact that Alabama's to travel to Oklahoma to play this game. So Oklahoma, it's hard to beat a good team twice, but the comforting thing is now you have home field advantage where beforehand you had to travel to Bryant-Denny. And I think that helps alleviate some of that worry about facing a good team that is technically more talented than you twice. I love Oklahoma in this spot because of their defense, and I do not think that Alabama's offense is going to have a fun time getting down the field. I expect Oklahoma to force multiple turnovers, to get multiple sacks. And while I don't think they'll run away with this game because Alabama's defense is too good to allow Oklahoma's offense to cash in on a lot of those turnovers to the fullest extent, it would not shock me at the end of the day if Oklahoma maybe wins by 10 because they just win that turnover battle and those turnovers begin stacking on top of each other. In the same way that I think DeBoer and Alabama probably learned some things from that first matchup, I think Oklahoma learned some things from that first matchup too. And Alabama, based on what I've seen later in the year compared to what I've seen from Oklahoma, I think a lot of Oklahoma's issues were more fixable in the short term than Alabama's are. And if those rumors about Ty Simpson being injured are true, if Alabama can't get healthy, as a large portion of their starters were out in that SEC championship game and got dinged up. Meanwhile, Oklahoma, they have an extra week of rest. Mateer's probably at his healthiest for the first time in a while, and they've had an extra amount of time to prepare for the playoffs. I think that Oklahoma might be better now in this game than they were in that November game, and Alabama could be worse. That plus Oklahoma now having the home field advantage means I think this is a wrong team is favored situation, and I like Oklahoma to win here and advance to the Rose Bowl to play Indiana. The defense for Miami is also a reason why I like them against Texas A&M. Miami is a 3-point underdog to the Texas A&M Aggies this Saturday, where they will play noon Eastern time, 11 a.m. local time. I'm picking Miami to win. I love Miami in this spot. There are questions I have about Carson Beck and his ability to keep the football safe. Those also exist for Texas A&M's Marcel Reed, though. And the difference between Miami and Texas A&M, the biggest difference in my mind, is that Miami's defense is more reliable and more trustworthy. You have Mike Elko for A&M. You have Corey Heatherman for Miami. I think those defensive play callers are pretty equivalent. But Miami analytically is ahead of the Aggies. When you look defensively for these teams, adjusted EPA per play, Miami is 15th, averaging negative 0.12 EPA per play. Texas A&M is 18th, negative 0.11. Miami does a better job in run defense, allowing 4.23 yards per carry, and Texas A&M allows 5.82 yards per carry. Both are high in havoc rate. A&M's pass defense is better in success rate and in yards per dropback allowed. Miami is superior in yards per play allowed. Both defenses pretty similar, but I think Miami has the edge in a variety of categories, and I think their defensive front is better, and they have more talented players on that side overall. The only offensive reason that I can see for Miami here is if the rushing attack is good enough to where Beck does not have to carry the offense, and Beck behind that offensive line can hit Malachi Toney or CJ Daniels a few times to loosen up that defense and gain an edge over that A&M secondary. That's one outcome that I can think of offensively. But much like why I think Oklahoma is going to beat Alabama, I believe Miami will beat A&M primarily because of their defense. It's the biggest reason why. And it's because A&M, with their screen game and with their rushing attack and with Reed's mobility, they want to run the ball on you. And I think Miami has the perfect defensive line, perfect defensive front to be side-to-side enough, athletic enough, and strong enough to where I do not think they will be got in any area in the short game, in the quick game, in the rushing game. They won't be gotten up the middle. They won't be gotten on the outsides either. How A&M will get to Miami is if Reed steps up and his offensive line protects him well for long enough to where on enough obvious passing downs, sometimes it won't work because much like Carson Beck, Reed is inaccurate at times, but there will be enough obvious passing downs to where A&M can have enough sustained drives to score in the 20s, and their defense does a good enough job against Miami's offense to hold them to the lower 20s or high teens. But Miami's path to victory here is forcing turnovers. They forced 34 sacks on the year, 20 season takeaways. They're 6th in ESPN's FPI efficiency. College Football Nerds has referenced them before as one of the best defenses in college football. I can't disagree with that. They're 7th in rushing yards allowed per game and points allowed per game. When you look at yards per carry for this team, they are top 20 there. When you look at the havoc rate they generate, havoc plays, they're top 5, only behind Indiana, Oklahoma, A&M, and Texas Tech. I love what they have on that side of the football. I really do. And defense wins championships. I know Miami is playing on the road in a crowd and environment they have not faced before, but you have all juniors or seniors on that defensive front. Ruben Bain Jr., David Blay Jr., Ahmad Moten Sr., Akeem Mesidor, Mohamed Touré, Wesley Besainth. In the depth spot, you got Armando Blout, Justin Scott, Malik Bryant, Marquise Lightfoot, Kamal Bonner, and Raul Aguirre Jr. The defensive front's deep enough and strong enough to where I think they can consistently get pressure on Reed. More importantly than that, I think they'll do a really good job stopping the run. And if O.J. Frederic is finally healthy and they can get some of those guys back, whether at, 80%, 70%, 90%, just getting them back and having more depth at secondary, I think, should help them against Mario Craver, Casey Conception, and a wide receiver core for A&M that is really good and lethal, especially when Reed is on his A game and playing his A or A+ ball. I don't think necessarily the wrong team is favored here because Kyle Field is probably one of those environments that is more than 3 points when looking at spreads. Like it's worth more than the usual 3-point home field advantage. But I think Miami has some matchup edges here where their power rushing attack against A&M's defensive line will do a better job than A&M's more explosive rushing attack against Miami's defensive line and defensive front. I think Miami will win the ground game, in large part because of their defense. I think they will win the trench game, in part because of their defensive line, but also because of their offensive line. And I think that Beck is more experienced than Reed in these type of games and spots. And all those things will come together and help Miami overcome some advantages that A&M has, such as home field advantage, their explosiveness on offense and defense, and help them advance to the Cotton Bowl to play the Ohio State Buckeyes. This has been fun, guys. This has been fun. A fun show. Anyone have any super chats? No. But just want to thank you to Fight On Natties for consistently participating in the live chat, USC fans. So fight on. We're actually going to talk about USC right now and why I think they're Bowl game is very important. USC's Alamo Bowl appearance may not seem to be critical on the surface, but I promise you, with Jade Mayava returning, with much of the defense returning, with what TCU has been able to put together on offense under Sonny Dykes in this season, this is an important game for the Trojans because it will showcase what USC has done developmentally with some of its younger players, with what they might have at receiver, and TCU will actually be one of the better offenses they've played all season long because the Big Ten is not known for offense. Their schedule outside of Notre Dame and Oregon hasn't really showcased a lot of good offenses. And you possibly are fighting for a 10th win here. And that should matter. It'd be Riley's second 10-win season in his 4 seasons with USC. And while it's not in the playoffs, USC, I think, already had a successful year going 9-3 and showing they could win games with Big Ten football. So getting that 10th win and entering next year with plenty of momentum would be huge in my mind. TCU's passing attack is 14th in success rate, 48.7% success rate there. It's 30th in yards per play with 7.59 yards per play. The Horned Frogs have really struggled in running the football this year. But with Josh Hoover and with Joseph Manjack IV, Jordan Dyer, and Eric McAllister, they have multiple receivers over 500 yards receiving. McAllister has 10 receiving touchdowns and over 1,000 receiving yards. Dyer has 7 touchdowns, 730 receiving yards. And Manjack has over 500 receiving yards. They have really good receivers there. The TCU Horned Frogs do. And TCU, when you look at havoc rate, is above average. They're only allowing a, 13, well, that's defensively, 13.5% havoc rate generated there. But they do have a good run defense, only allowing 4.3 yards per carry. And offensively, for the Horned Frogs, their havoc rate allowed is actually, fairly respectable. Allow a 13.7% havoc rate. They're high in success rate passing wise. They do struggle running the football. Offensively, consequentially, they've been, back and forth this year. But TCU as a team, they're 8-4, 5-4. They're a competent Big 12 team. I think Sonny Dykes is a good coach and runs a respected operation. So this is going to be a test for a USC defense that, is 61st in adjusted EPA per play. And athletically, I think they improved from last year. I think this year they have a higher ceiling than they did last year. But their floor seems to be just as low. They're not very deep. And with a month to prepare, what's USC's defense going to look like against this TCU team that can get you through the air? And with some of USC's, issues on its defensive front that they've had, a mediocre TCU rushing offense might be able to generate something against this USC defense. It's a test of depth. It's a test of program pride, I think. And do your starters with this long to prepare and how your staff has been praised as good as I think USC staff is, does that translate with how long of a break they have to prepare for this game? Do the younger players step up? Do they have a really good game here as they did against, say, Louisville in 2023? Or do they look pretty mediocre or questionable, and you kind of have a little bit of a different feeling entering next year because, oh my gosh, well, the top players carried the team. Riley's been successful with bowl games ever since that, loss to Tulane, where Louisville, they exceeded expectations. Against Texas A&M, they exceeded expectations. This year, you want to see more of that, where in the postseason, their depth players and their younger players do a really good job and step up in a way that isn't exactly expected, especially with how this year, unlike last year and unlike the prior year, was actually a success, all things considered. Going 9-3 with this schedule and having moments against Oregon or Notre Dame where if some luck bounced their way, they maybe could have pulled out those games. and Illinois was a winnable game, that's something where they can go out and have a successful season and really add the cherry on top to what is, I think, a high-quality vanilla shake of a year. It's not perfect. A perfect season would have been USC probably beating Illinois or finding a way to be one of the final seeds in the playoffs. But I liked what they put together this year, especially on offense. This is the first year since 2022, and maybe the first year overall where they really ran a true Lincoln Riley offense that could jam the ball down your throat. Wide receiver, quarterback, and tight end are areas that I'm going to pay attention to. I know that Maava has officially returned, but I imagine in this game you might see a little bit of Hassan Longstreet, especially if they get up big. And at that point, it's going to be important to see, well, this is the first time he's really had consistent passing reps against a defense. Even if it's defeated, even if you're ahead of TCU by multiple scores, you're still facing good athletes who want to show out. So how does Hassan Longstreet look? I mean, how does Maava look with a month to prepare? How do the young receivers look? You're going to get two new kinds here, but I imagine that Makai Lemon and Jacoby Lane won't be playing in this game. I imagine Lake McCree, well, McCree might, because this game could boost his draft stock, but you're going to see more of the younger tight ends too in this game. So how do they look? And defensively, linebacker and safety. How do those positions look? Where there will be some youth there and some new faces next year with Eric Gentry leaving. And even with the defensive line, Devin Tompkins just announced that he's entering the transfer portal. And you're losing Anthony Lucas. So how does that position group, how does the defense as a whole, with this long to prepare and with the strengths that TCU has on offense, how do they look in this bowl game against a decently coached team, a decently talented roster, and if Josh Hoover plays, and I mean maybe he entered the portal, it's hard to keep up with all this stuff, but against a competent offensive team and a good quarterback and great receivers, what happens? Like, what do they do? Do they succeed? Do they get torn to shreds? Is it somewhere in between? Does USC win this game? And how do they look in winning this game? Or how do they look in losing this game? I think this is an important game for USC where they already have momentum in recruiting. They have momentum for next year. They're bringing back some key players. A win here can really set the tone for next year. And it's not as important as it used to be. These bowl games aren't. But you also can get an idea of how your younger players might look. And that's important for USC and will help them evaluate where their roster is at. Okay, few more topics we'll get on out of here. And then these videos will be uploaded today and they will be uploaded tomorrow. So, wanted to get to this really, really quickly. I think that Jeremiah Smith was snubbed for the Biletnikoff Award. I understand that Jeremiah Smith did not put up eye-popping, insane numbers. I get that. It's why I don't think Makai Lemon winning this award is totally egregious. However, I also believe that if you watch the games, it's pretty clear that Jeremiah Smith is the best player for Ohio State. He's one of the best players on their team. He's one of the best offensive players in college football. He, I would say, probably still is the best offensive player in college football, even though Jeremiah Love got invited to the Heisman ceremony over him. He should have won the Biletnikoff. And some games that I point to support my argument as to why he should are the UCLA and Rutgers games, where the offense looked totally different and at times disheveled, even against some of the worst defenses in the country, because they did not have access to Smith. I mean, Rutgers has one of the worst rushing defenses I have ever seen, analytically and on film. Their defense is awful, dreadful. UCLA's is pretty similar to that. And Jeremiah Smith, in 11 games, had over 1,000 receiving yards, had, well, technically 11 and a half, because he played for half of that UCLA game, but sat out the second half, didn't play at all for Rutgers, had 11 touchdowns, a long of 87, averaging 13.6 yards per pass attempt, top 10 in receptions, and top 25 in targets. Yes, Makai Lemon had better numbers, fourth in total receiving yards, 11th, tied with Jeremiah Smith in touchdowns, and averaged more yards per, pass attempt. But Mekhi Lemon played in basically the same amount of games as Jeremiah Smith did. Mekhi Lemon is fantastic. He is one of the best receivers in the country. He is certainly top 5. However, I do not think that he is better than Jeremiah Smith or Carnell Tate when both are healthy. And I think that this award, same thing with a lot of awards. Like I saw some of the names on different All-American, listings, and I thought, geez, like Caden Proctor's not an All-American. I'm sorry. And that feels very much like, well, he's big, he's tall, we love his measurables, we liked him preseason. It's like, nuh-uh. No, you don't get to do that. That's wrong. It's the same thing with how I saw that Caleb Downs was not on an All-American safety list. Thought that was pretty stupid. Carson Hinsman got All-American respect, and I think he's been pretty good, but All-Americans meant to go to the best, not a pretty good player. Carson Hinsman is a pretty good player. I don't think he's the best center in college football or one of the best centers in college football. So I feel like with a lot of these All-American lists, they try to be different, or they just go with stats or different names, or they try to, make sure they have a certain prerequisite of players from certain schools on these lists. It's like, no. Sure, Jeremiah Smith didn't lead the nation in receiving yards, but that's not his fault. It's more important that he was healthy for the playoffs than he played against Rutgers, or he has another great receiver in Carnell Tate on the other side, who's almost as good as he is. Ohio State loves to play slow tempo so that they can make sure their defense doesn't get exhausted so they can stay healthy. And because I think for most games, they just kind of want to get the heck on out of there. It's not his fault. So I think that he is clearly the best wide receiver in football. And if someone is the best and they've been healthy for most of the year and they're still putting up really good numbers, then they should win the award. It'd be one thing if Jeremiah Smith was out for half the year. Then yeah, Mekhi Lemon deserved it over him. And again, I think Lemon is a great football player. But with these awards and with these honorings, I don't think that they are assessed as properly as they are, if that makes sense. Like, should Skylar Bell be on the All-American list ahead of Carnell Tate? I don't think so. Maybe I'm wrong for thinking that way. But as long as a player isn't out for much of the year, the awards and the All-American selections and all of these things should go to the best players, not players who are flirting with being the best, not great players, not good players, but the absolute best of players. Like for the Heisman, for example, I don't think that Diego Pavia should have won the Heisman. I don't think he should have been as high as he was on the Heisman ballots. I don't think Julian Sayin deserved the Heisman as much as Jeremiah Smith, or even Carnell Tate, or Caleb Downs. I personally probably would have still voted for Jeremiah Smith to win the Heisman if I had a vote, because he's that good. I would have voted for him probably, or with how Mendoza looked in the Big Ten title game, maybe Mendoza too. Award should go to the best players in the sport as long as they are healthy. If, say, there's clearly a best player in the sport, but he's injured for half the year, you do have to value production to a certain degree. I agree with that. But there just was not enough of a difference in production between Lemon and Smith to where I feel comfortable saying that Lemon deserved that award over Smith. Like, that was kind of ridiculous, if I got to be honest. It's the same thing in 2022 where somehow Jalen Hyatt wins the award over Marvin Harrison Jr. It's like, anyone who watches those two knows that Harrison's the better player. Just Tennessee loves up-tempo stuff, and Hyatt was the only receiver they had. Ohio State that year, even though they weren't as slow as they are now, they played with still a slower pace than Tennessee did, and they had better wide receiver depth than Tennessee did, with Jalen Hyatt and Cedric Tillman being injured for much of that year. Make sure the best players get the best awards, because otherwise that makes those players rightfully feel disrespected, and it kind of cheapens those awards. Some final topics to discuss, then we'll get on out of here. It's been a really good stream. An incredible show, by the way, guys. Thank you for making this awesome. I want to talk about some Michigan State hires, then get to Nebraska's expectations. Michigan State has made a collection of wonderful hires on the defensive side of the ball. Hiring Max Bulla and Winston DeLatte on defense has been incredible and is a wonderful decision. Max Bulla and Winston DeLatte are Big Ten caliber, Michigan State caliber hires. They are upgrades over the previous coaches at those positions. It helps, I think, that DeLatte has worked with defensive coordinator Joe Rossi before. Max Bulla has worked under Al Golden at Notre Dame. Linebacker for Notre Dame was a strength of the defense last year and this year. He's recruited well. He's developed well at that position. DeLatte was a big part of the reason why Minnesota's defense last year and this year has had success, where a lot of Minnesota's current defensive linemen were recruited and developed by him, and they've gotten better and better most seasons there at Minnesota, even after his departure. It's just that ripple effect where when you have a great coach at a school like Minnesota, even after you leave, those players are still stellar there and stand out among those players. So those are fantastic hires for the Spartans, and I think speak to the mission that Pat Fitzgerald has at Michigan State. That is, we care about defense. We want our defense to be fundamentally sound. We want to field top 25 defenses again. And what makes these hires huge is that you have a linebacker coach from Notre Dame who Notre Dame wanted to keep, probably at some point would have offered the co-DC position to him, and he goes to Michigan State. That's his alma mater. You gave him a good raise, gave him a good salary, gave him a promotion, and with the serious money and investment you have and the coaching staff you now have a solid anchor to the defensive position group. It's the same thing with Joe Rossi. Joe Rossi did a great job at Minnesota as their DC. He had one bad year. Last year for Michigan State, he really was an upgrade from Scotty Hazelton. This year, early on, they really struggled, but towards the end of the year, they improved, for sure. I think a lot of that was a player thing for Michigan State and how Jonathan Smith and Michigan State managed their resources and how the boosters didn't like Smith or support him from the beginning. I don't think Smith was a bad coach. I think that Michigan State just from the jump didn't like him and support him, and things just quickly fell and the relationship quickly soured. For Fitzgerald, it doesn't feel like that. So these hirings, much like a lot of Smith's hirings, I think were good, but now they actually have backing, and Bulla is a huge move. DeLatte is a really big move with what he did at Minnesota, doing a lot more with less, and he has a familiar face working with him. That's a good pairing. Michigan State has lacked competent defensive front play since 2021. I think that's going to come back under this regime. Rossi being retained, entering his third year, players that are staying on the roster will understand his system. Players coming in will know what they are getting. And he's been, I think, a top leader on the team with how he came down from the booth to coach the defense. And he's been a good recruiter, finding diamonds in the rough at Minnesota and Michigan State. So I think that was a good move. What Michigan State needs to do with these hires is a top 25 defense needs to be in play. Maybe not this year. It's a lot to ask. But in year two, yeah. And they need to make strides this year from where they were for much of the Smith era. I think that these coaches will certainly develop, but you never know. We need to see development out of these guys instantaneously because of how bad it's been. Just getting a competent coach in year one should just show some type of progress. And they also need to go to the portal because I believe in their development for sure, but they certainly need some guys from other schools to come to East Lansing because of how poor the roster is from a talent angle. These are stellar hires regardless of that, though, and they make me more confident that Pat Fitzgerald is going to work out at Michigan State. I am more confident in that now than I was at the time of the hiring, due to what I would say are stellar hires on the defensive side of the ball in terms of assistants. And last but not least, Nebraska and what the Cornhuskers should expect. If there are any Cornhuskers in this live chat right now, tell me what you think the expectations should be for Nebraska this coming season. I'm curious, because mine have changed a little bit. Not even in a negative way, just kind of, recalibrating things. They have changed. There's not really a way to sugarcoat it. Nebraska fell short of expectations this year. Even with the quarterback injury, the schedule was easy. The roster in year 3 you would have expected to make a leap. Nebraska was finally able to win some close games, and you'd expect that to parlay into 8 or 9 wins. They got Michigan when Michigan was in more of a mess than we thought they were in, and when Penn State turned out to be, pretty mediocre. And yet, they only won 7 games. They went 7-5. The defense regressed a lot. It was Nebraska's worst defense under Rule. We talked about this in the preseason. We said that it would be a unit that would certainly take steps back. But what I didn't expect personally was the offensive line to look as bad as it did. I didn't even think Emmett Johnson would be as good as he was. But that didn't really matter because the O-line was regressed that much. Receiver was a little bit, I would say, filled expectations but didn't exceed them. Raiola, I think, was as good as I expected, but with a little bit of a higher ceiling, but a much lower floor. The injury did not help. Nebraska's special teams took a big step forward. The defensive line and linebacker core, I thought D-line would be bad, linebacker would be okay. Linebacker was disappointing, and D-line was truly, truly awful. And I also think that some bad coaching decisions were made throughout the year. Can't sugarcoat it. It was a disappointing season, all things considered. And with Raiola entering the portal, with it being year 4, with Nebraska having a recruiting class outside the top 100 because they got really big classes previously, they're a very young team, and they're going to use the portal heavily. What should the expectations be for 2026? Well, let's check out the schedule first. So, Ohio, Bowling Green, and North Dakota are your non-conference games. Honestly, I would have loved to see Nebraska play Tennessee, and I wish that game was not canceled. Really wish that game was not canceled. I still think it's kind of a travesty that it was. That game should be played. I could also make the argument, though, that this works to Nebraska's benefit now that Raiola isn't here, and with how badly this year went sideways in terms of the expectations. Nebraska's win total was 7.5, which is why I thought that if they got to 8 and if they looked competent in a variety of ways, that the year would have been a success. However, they went under their win total, and the way they finished the year, even outside of Raiola, was very, very poor. The way they finished the year, even factoring out Raiola, was poor, where they got worse and worse and worse as the season went on, and it became very evident in my mind that the only reason they were a good team was because of Raiola. Like, Raiola was the entire team. He was the best player on the team, one of the best players, and certainly the most impactful. With where Tennessee's heading and with where Nebraska's heading roster-wise, that might be another kind of, okay, we're going to check that off as a loss preseason. And with where Nebraska is and the expectations they have for themselves, and it feels like the fans are growing restless, I feel like you kind of want as many wins as possible. And this schedule's already tough. Think about it. Road games at Illinois, at Iowa, at Michigan State, at Oregon, at Rutgers. You have more road conference games than home conference games. You have 7 home games, 5 road games. And the home games are Ohio State, Indiana, Maryland, and Washington. Since Jed Fish is out of the Michigan picture, Washington's going to be good next year. Maryland is probably your only guaranteed win on this schedule outside of North Dakota, Bowling Green, and Ohio. If everything falls apart, which I don't think it will, but say it does, the worst possible case scenario is 4-8, which would be a disaster. The best possible case, if you put Tennessee on the schedule, I think would certainly be 8-4. Now, with that easy non-con, and depending on how the Big Ten schedule is lined up, it could probably be 9-3, but maybe even still 8-4. If you are Nebraska, you want to improve off of last year, where, just pulling up some power ratings here quickly, Nebraska this year, this is before the bowl game, and I have a feeling Utah's going to beat them pretty badly. So they'll probably fall in power ratings after that. They are 7-5. They have a 6.1 FPI score, which is 44th. Last year, in that metric, they had a 6.9 FPI score, which was 38th. Now, power ratings factor in priors. They factor in talent. They're not perfect. They aren't. And pre-injury to Raiola, I think this Nebraska team was better than last year's Nebraska team. Post-Raiola injury, though, I think last year's Nebraska team was better than this year's Nebraska team, looking at the post-injury. In efficiency, though, efficiency does not measure priors. It does not include priors. It's all about how a team plays on any given Saturday. This is why earlier in the year, Ohio State in efficiency wasn't even like top 10 in week 1. But as the season progressed, they evolved, and now they're number 2, and Indiana's number 1. And the teams at the top are at the top of efficiency. The teams at the bottom are in the bottom of efficiency. Efficiency is really only about this year. And I think it's better to measure teams from different seasons by their efficiency and by how well they did that year, rather than looking at power ratings that could be affected by things that don't have much to do with this year or that aren't in control of the coaches and players once the season begins. For efficiency, Nebraska last year had a 66.8 score, and they were 39th, with the 49th best defense, the 19th, or the 49th best offense, 19th best defense, and 112th best special teams. This year, they are 57th in efficiency, with a 57.8 rating. They have the 56th best offense, the 65th best defense, the 11th best special teams. Now, again, if Raiola were healthy for the whole year, that offensive efficiency score probably looks a heck of a lot better. Way better. It's probably like in the top 40. So you get the picture there. But overall, I think there's a case that in the same way Nebraska this year was better than last year overall, there's also a case that they were worse than last year. They kind of were the same team at the end of this year that they were last year. And that's also pretty disappointing. And you don't want that to happen next year. And there's a good chance that happens next year with Raiola leaving. Your one player with alien potential is gone. You're one player. You can also upgrade at other positions. They probably will upgrade at other positions. They'll probably be better on defense. They'll probably be better on the offensive line. But you also probably will have a less talented quarterback. So factoring that in mind, and also understanding that Nebraska isn't back yet. So until they're back, as long as they're improving, you shouldn't have blue blood expectations for them yet. What you need to see is continued improvement. So in regular season record, they have improved every year. In power ratings, there's an argument to say they've improved every year. You need to see that next year, where they improve in power ratings, they improve in record. So go 8-4, and if you go 8-4, especially with that schedule, which is harder than this year's schedule, harder than last year's. It's the hardest schedule I think Matt Rule has faced at Nebraska. You go 8-4 with that schedule, you know this program has some substance to it. They have some punch to it, and that will be a success, I think. 8-4, 9-3. We'll get to that a little bit later for the specifics. They must continue their linear progress. Field the top 25 defense. I think that's doable in year one. They did it with Tony White for 2 years in a row. This defense was pretty atrocious at the end of the year, but I think a lot of that was play calling and development and just the bodies they had and the youth they had up front. Next year, they'll be older. They'll have a better defensive coordinator with Rob Orich. They'll probably have a better defensive line coach. And with enough returning at different positions, Nebraska should return a lot of its production outside of quarterback. They should be in a position where they can be around a top 25 defense next year. And if they do that with what could be some improvements on offense, they can win those 8-9 games. With Jeep Wade being hired, and looking at Nebraska's depth chart here, Rocco Spindler is gone. Elijah Pritchett is back. Turner Corcoran will be gone. Henry Lutovsky will be gone. But Pritchett could come back. Justin Evans-Jenkins could come back. And all of their backup offensive linemen will be back if Jeep Wade and the staff decide that they are worthy of still being on scholarship, still being at Nebraska, and they keep them. I also imagine they'll be going hunting for linemen both offensively and defensively in the portal. Therefore, and especially with his reputation at Georgia Tech, I think Jeep Wade needs to show immediate impact, and Nebraska needs to field their best offensive line under Matt Rule at Nebraska next year, immediately. I thought they would this year. It did not pan out that way. They actually regressed from where they were last year, especially as the season went on. In October was the low point. And then I think they rose a little bit, mostly because I think that Holgorsen changed some things up. Latif was more mobile and got rid of the football quicker, and Emmett Johnson got better as the year went on too. They also need to find a good quarterback. He doesn't have to have the highs that Raiola does, but preferably he shouldn't have the lows either, and overall should be a pretty similar quarterback to what Raiola was this year. Just don't have the lows, maybe you don't have the same highs, but with a better supporting cast. Think about it this way. Sorsby or Childs with a great supporting cast would be better than this past season's Raiola with just the supporting cast he had. Because after he gets hit enough times, the probability of him getting hurt goes up. That eventually came true, sadly, this year. And he eventually gets gunshot, rattled, confused, kind of loses his confidence. Think about Bryce Underwood at Michigan this year. Underwood pretty much plateaued overall throughout the year because his supporting cast wasn't all that great and he wasn't receiving good coaching. So I think they can find a competent QB in the portal and do something with him. And overall, that leads me to think that an 8-4, 9-3 record is the barometer of success. We said that would be the case this year. They underperformed, but with Raiola leaving, which I didn't expect, a lot of people didn't expect until he was hurt, and with new developments and how tough the schedule is, I think that 8-4, 9-3 is a success for Nebraska next year. Flirting with the playoffs next year, which would be, I think, 9-3. If you finish 8-4 and at some point say you were 7-2, 6-2, 8-2, you'd be flirting with the playoffs at that point. That would be impressive with this schedule. I think with the new hires he's made, the fact that he has made Nebraska somewhat respected again, and the unexpected departure of Raiola and the 2027 recruiting class that it looks like Nebraska could bring in, I think you got to give him some more time to firmly enter a playoff or bust caliber season. And with Nebraska, honestly, until they reach the playoffs, I have a hard time saying a season is playoff or bust. Nebraska just hasn't won 9 regular season games since 2016, and that schedule is easier than this one. So with the new era and with where Rule has brought Nebraska to its highest since the Bo Pelini era, I think you got to give him some grace there and at least see this whole thing play out and continue to believe in him and give him momentum and resources. It's going to be tough to go 8-4, 9-3 next year with the circumstances and with that schedule, but I think that is what would classify as success, especially after falling short of expectations in 2025. Okay, that's it, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. I am starving, and my friend is coming over in 30, 45 minutes, so I got to go. I got to eat. But be back here Friday at noon Eastern time. We'll be going live then. It'll be fantastic. It'll be good, as always, and these clips and segments will be out today and tomorrow, and be expecting some more interviews to drop. I know you guys love those. I love those. I'm going to try to get some more interviews here. Make sure to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and see us on the next live show. I'll see you all very soon, and have a good day.